go live now on YouTube. So good morning, Americas. Good afternoon, Africa and Europe. Good late afternoon, Asia. And hey, mate, if you're in Australia, we have some subscribers from Australia and you're with us, then I'm really amazed. So my name is Carsten Schradin. I'm a researcher at the CNRS in Strasbourg, France. And I'm one of the 3 co-hosts of the FIND seminar series together with Eduardo Fernando Duque and Lauren Hayes. And as we had a break between the fall and the spring term, and also because we have many more participants to find than in the last term, I would like to give you a little bit of an overview. We, in the meantime, are more than 400 registered participants from all over the world. And the idea of the FIND, of course, came into existence with this corona crisis that did not allow us to travel anymore. We wanted still to meet once a week. The main aim of FIND is to really have fun, to enjoy, because we're all fascinated by social evolution. And the aim for the future will also, once this corona pandemic is over, to maintain FIND, because we all prefer to meet each other in person. But we also all know we cannot travel every week to meet people, and some people cannot even do it once a year. And we will then maintain, hopefully, this FIND seminar, even after the pandemic, to have this opportunity to get fascinated by social evolution. So quickly give you an overview. I don't want to spend too much time here. Then we have the talk by Tim Clutton-Brock, which will be followed by a long discussion of 1 hour. But there might be still more questions than we can cover within 1 hour, but we will then have to stop also to give Tim a break, because he's still meeting with some of the organizers afterwards. But we also like to keep this seminar, of course, social. So after the 1 hour of discussion, we can still stick around here on Zoom and discuss issues with each other that are of any other interest, like just we talked about the pecaries. The people that are here on Zoom, they can later, and I will tell you after the talk from Tim how they can then ask questions here on Zoom. The people that join us on YouTube, you can use the chat function on YouTube. And one of my students, Jingyu, will then at some stage bring the questions into the Zoom discussion here, and we will then also try to answer these questions. Another announcement that we are very, here you see that we are live, at least I hope. Yes, I stop this. Another announcement, and we will talk in detail about this in 2 weeks, is that we now have a homepage for the FIND seminar, which I will put for you into the chat when I find it. We will talk about this in detail in 2 weeks, but you can already go there and explore this homepage. So this is about the FIND itself, and then it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker of the spring term, Tim Clutton-Brock, was really one of the silverbacks of the most important people in our field of behavioral ecology. He started his studies actually on primates, but is most known then later for his work on red deer, soy sheep, meerkats, and also the Mammalian mole rats. He is founder of the Kalahari Meerkat project. We already had Martha Manser in the last term giving a presentation about her work on meerkats that's mainly focusing on communication, and Tim will talk about the meerkats today again. He's a fellow of the Royal Society and got in 2012 the Darwin Award from the Society. And there are so many things one could tell about him, and I just want to focus on 3 things, 2 that are important for me and 1 that is important for him. The first one is, I think he's so important for our field also because of the training he offered for generations of young scientists that were directly working with him, like Martha Manser, Andrew Young, or people that had the opportunity to benefit from the field sites he built up in the Kalahari, like Arpad Oskul, Mike Scantlebury, and many others. And this is very important for our field to train the next generation. The second one is that he is an extraordinary scientist. He had, if I counted it right, 16 articles in Science, 33 in Nature. That's just amazing. And we, as the field of behavioral ecology, we need people like this that can publish in these high-ranking journals to show that behavioral ecology is important. And thus he is doing their service, I think, for the entire field by being able to publish these papers that are then read by the entire scientific community. Then the third point that he wanted me to emphasize is he's also within the Council of the Tropical Biology Association, which is specializing in training young scientists in conservation and in ecology, and especially with a focus of young scientists from African countries. So they trained over the years about 2,000 young scientists, half of them coming from 29 different countries in Africa. And it is very important for conservation in Africa that we, of course, also that there's also somebody training the people there. And here is this homepage you can have a look at, tropicalbiology.org. I will also try to put this into the chat. I see I'm actually, I was messaging the people in the waiting room, not you. So now you have it. And he said, if you're interested to participate in this, please check out the website, see what you can do. Like, they're always interested in getting also experienced scientists from Europe or the United States or worldwide to participate in teaching these young scientists, conservationists. They're also especially interested to get people that can speak French, in Francophone people, because, you know, in Africa, also many countries, French is one important language. And so please check this website out and try to support this very important initiative. So with this, I already think I said enough, and I think it also shows again how important the work is that Tim is doing, not only on the level of basic sciences that we're all interested in, but also with helping to form new generations of nature conservationists in Africa. And now I'm looking very much forward to your talk, Tim, and would kindly ask you to share your screen.
Okay. This is the moment of truth. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Basic, advanced, sure.
Yes, yep. We see the screen. If you then.
What I don't see.
Open PowerPoint.
I'm screen sharing. How do I open PowerPoint?
Yeah, you have it. I see there on the Mac. You have it there at the bottom, a PowerPoint sign. There, yeah.
The screen sharing now. New share.
Oh,
Fantastic. Fantastic.
It's working.
I now feel I can feel my adrenaline levels going down immediately. Thank you very much indeed, Carsten and Eduardo and Lauren, both for that introduction, but thank you also very much for Fine. I think it's been a godsend for a lot of people. Certainly it has for me. I've hugely enjoyed it. And I'm very struck at the degree of common interest and common enthusiasm relating to animals that are really terribly different right across the syndrome. So I think that Fine has hit a spot for a lot of people in bringing many people together and in helping them to share their interests. So thank you very much to all the organizers for organizing Fine and then for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about cooperative breeding today principally, but I'm going to start with a brief overview. From my perspective, it's useful to think of there being two main groups of mammalian societies. Firstly, there are species where females have separate ranges, though they may overlap to some extent, but that individual females tend not to associate. They tend to be intolerant of each other in many cases, or they tend to avoid each other and then males map themselves onto the system. So in some of them, like North American red squirrels, the males occupy different territories. In others, they form pairs with individual females. And then very commonly, one has males having larger ranges than multiple females. And I'm going to be calling that, insofar as I talk about these species, I talk about them as solitary breeders, but what are, I totally accept what various people have pointed out, including Carsten, that the females have social lives in all these species, they have social connections, but they tend to have a common phenomenon, they have separate ranges. And then there are social breeders where multiple breeding females live together in groups, which may either contain a single male, as in black and white colobus, or multiple males, as in baboons. And in the primates and in a number of other species, particularly some carnivores, these groups are relatively stable. And then there's another category of social breeders where basically the female groups are unstable. In some of them, like red deer or seals, males defend smaller territories or harems within the female ranges, and females that are receptive either come and visit these or are brought into them by males. And then in situations where female density is relatively low, as in particular in elephants and whales, where the density of receptive females is extremely low, the males don't try and collect groups of females, they tend to range much more widely, and they go and defend individual females at a time for a relatively short period. And I started life working on on social breeders. So I worked originally in Tanzania and then in Uganda on red colobus and black and white colobus, which are live in stable groups with typically one male in black and white colobus and multi-males in red. And my thesis was concerned with trying to work out the reasons for that difference, which were topical at the time as a result of the work of John Crook and Steve Gartton. And I worked in Uganda and Tanzania. And while tropical forests are amazing and are fantastically diverse and fantastically interesting, they are not the ideal places for visibility. And I am amazed and awed by the amount of work that people working on arboreal primates in tropical forests put in to get their data out. I think it's quite amazing, but I decided after doing it myself, I didn't want to do it any longer. So I moved after I'd done my thesis, and in the Highlands of Scotland, where there are plenty of red deer, a combination of too many Scots people and too many sheep in the past has removed all the trees. And with the result, with all the trees gone, you can actually see what's happening with the deer fantastically well. And with Fiona Guinness in 1971, 72, we set up the red deer study where we picked up, Fiona had learned to recognize the individual deer, and we started with a population of around 150, 200 red deer hinds and about half as many stags again. And that study started in 72 is still running today. So we're now dealing with the life histories of large numbers of individuals on the island of Rum up there in Scotland. And one of the attractive things, apart from the fact that there are no trees with red deer, is that they all live on one flat plain, and you can actually catch the young. So we catch most of the young each year of the red deer, and we blood sample them and we tag them, and then we monitor them for the rest of their lives. And after that was 72, and then 1985, I thought I'd do a bit of a move, but was wedded to the west of Scotland, and I moved to work on Soay sheep, which, unlike deer, are a cruising breeder, so males move around defending individual females at a time. And that's in about the most inaccessible island here, which is the island of St. Kilda. It's the flooded circulum of an old a volcano, and the sheep are sort of Bronze Age survivors, which have been there for the last couple of thousand years. By 1993, I'd been working for 20, 30 years, effectively on polygynous systems and on the evolution of sex differences and on the determinants of breeding success in males and females and the relevance of that for sexual selection. And I felt it was time for something entirely different. And so I wondered what to do, and I thought about various things. I played with the idea of working on polyandrous birds for a while, and had a look at button quail. But I went to South Africa, and at the same time I went to see meerkats in the Kalahari because I was interested in the possibility of working on cooperative breeders. And meerkats are one of a relatively small number of species which are, and I'll come back to this later, what I would call singular breeders. They're group living species. But they're group living species where typically one female virtually monopolises reproduction. In most of them, they don't do it completely, but, and I'll come back to this, one female does almost all the reproduction in their group, and they are characterized also by very extensive cooperation with other group members. So they have a number of unusual characteristics. Typically only one female per group breeds regularly. Others do so temporarily, and they'll have a crack at it, but they are often unsuccessful. And for quite extensive parts of their adult life, they're temporarily infertile. Temporarily meaning they can wind up their breeding systems and get them going again in a matter of weeks normally. Non-breeding subordinates typically rear the offspring of dominance. And it looks to me in all these systems as if most recruits are fathered by a single dominant male. It's not exclusive. More than one male breeds in most of these systems, but a high proportion of the offspring are fathered by one male. And they typically have high levels of average kinship between group members. So based on data by Brieger et al. And some other ones, here's a comparison of four of the cooperative breeding groups, the canids, the callitrichine primates, the mongooses, and the mole rats. And as you can see, they typically have much higher levels, average coefficients of relatedness between group members than do the social breeders, in particular the social breeders that produce single young. They can get a bit higher where they produce multiple young, as in lions, but it's very difficult for social breeders to produce groups that have high levels of relatedness. Now, these species raise a number of interesting questions for evolutionary breeders, for evolutionary ecologists and behavioral ecologists. Why don't the helpers breed? Why don't the helpers disperse? What effects does helping have? Is there a division of labor, as there is in some insects? Why help? Why not cheat? And what are the consequences of these unusual breeding systems? And of the potential cooperative breeders, I decided to work on the mongooses, picking up very much my experience in Scotland of wanting to work on in an open environment where one could see as much as possible. It's not always the case. If you look at the picture behind me, that's a picture of the Kalahari at the moment, where it's rained heavily, where the fossil rivers are running for the first time in 30 years, and where it's now a flowering and abundant environment, which has the disadvantage that the meerkats are very hard to see. We went to South Africa and set up here at the bottom of the Kalahari, just inside the South African border from Botswana, along the bed of a fossil river, which is what you see running through here. So it's mixed woodland, grassland, duneland, but it's not Kalahari type dunes, it's settled dunes. Meerkats live in open country, and you can see what they do. And although initially they're very wild and they run away when you come close, you can keep following them, keep going at them, and eventually they get very tame. And we've now worked on them for 25 to 30 years. And so we work with animals that are very well habituated to us indeed. We found out that people have asked me various stages what's the most important thing I found out about meerkats, and the straightforward answer is that is always the same. They love hard-boiled egg, and this was our major way into the system, because we were able with that to persuade individuals to come right up to us, and we've been for many years now. We've been able to weigh most of the animals that we work with on a daily basis. So here's in the early days, my wife Daphne, when we were first persuading to animals with crumbs of hard-boiled egg, and this is really very small amounts, so we'll weigh a group of 30 meerkats with half a hard-boiled egg, breaking it up into crumbs and getting them to climb onto electronic scales one by one so that we can record their weights. The problem is not that they're not keen once they learn how to do this. The problem is that they all want to climb on at the same time. And so we have to fend them off, and there's a danger that you get bitten in the process. But that's meant that we are able to weigh individuals on a regular basis. And most individuals are weighed several times a week, multiple times a day. We weigh everyone when they get up, when we're working with groups. We weigh them again at middle day so we can get their weight gain. We weigh them again in the evening before they go to bed, and we weigh them the following morning to see what they've lost overnight. And we try and collect 2 to 3 records of that kind for all individuals each week. So here's what actually goes on. We're getting them on one at a time, and they do sometimes now climb on us to act as to look for danger around, because we're the only thing that sticks up in that environment. And that's meant that they've become really very habituated to us indeed. We are able to paint marks on them to allow us to recognize individuals easily. Once their pups come above ground at about 21 days of age, they don't mind us picking them up. The meerkats really take no notice of that at all. And everyone's learned, because when they first come blinking into the light of day, they see us and they see the adults not taking any notice of us and not bothering about us. And that's meant that we can do a pile of unusual things. So Marta has been able to put a microphone close to them and ask them their views on a wide variety of topics. And it's, of course, much easier in this situation to make recordings from individual animals. And we've recently found that with a small reward, we can actually ultrasound pregnant females to measure rates of fetal loss. Here you see one of the assistants ultrasounding a pregnant female while she's getting a few crumbs of egg here. So that this has provided lots of opportunities. It also provides opportunities for us to take blood samples from animals, more or less whenever we want them. We can't take those without anesthetizing, and we try not to anesthetize any individual more than once every 3 months. So let me tell you a bit about the sort of basics of meerkats, vital statistics. They live in groups of 2 to 50 with an equal sex ratio. The dominant females in each group, there's one dominant female who produces 1 to 4, usually 2 or 3 litters of 2 to 6 pups every year. There's a gestation period of 60 to 70 days, a postpartum conception. Subordinates breed opportunistically when dominants can't control them anymore. So if the dominant gets sick or gets eaten or gets wounded by a predator, the subordinates start to breed. And the annual mortality is very high. It's of the order of 20 to 25%, which is across everyone. Let me just tell you briefly what I mean when I say they're singular breeders. If you look at the proportion of all pups born to dominants and subordinates, it's about equal. However, the proportion of litters that emerge for dominance is much higher, because dominants commonly kill subordinate litters. However, neither of those are really the way you want to look at it. You really want to look at what's the frequency of breeding by individuals. Now, this is the proportion of litters born per female, per dominant female, or per season. As you can see, there's an enormous and clear difference. And if you combine these, This is the mean offspring surviving to 6 months for dominants and subordinates. Now, subordinates do breed. They show lower estrogen levels, lower LH levels, and some of them are fairly unresponsive to challenge with GnRH, but they don't breed commonly. They breed opportunistically, and there's a huge difference between them and the breeding frequency of the dominant female. So this fits in with what Rubinstein says, what Dustin Rubinstein says, that there is a real distinction between these systems where one female virtually monopolizes reproduction and other social breeders where there will be differences, but which are not nearly as pronounced as this. Mating system. In the meerkats, around 80% of the dominant female's offspring are fathered by one resident immigrant dominant male, who does almost all the mating, guards the female when she's in estrus for the first 2 weeks after that she gives birth. Subordinates breed with roving males from other groups. They're related to most of the males in the group, and meerkats don't breed with close relatives, or very seldom do. There's one other quirk. 30% of dominant females at any one time have lost their partner because someone's eaten him. And under those circumstances, if there are lots of natal males who are not potential breeders, of course, because they're related to the dominant female, they prevent other males from coming into the group, leaving a situation where they have their mother, who's the dominant female, who has no access to an unrelated partner in the same group. Dominant females under these circumstances breed outside the group, and they breed with roving males too. So in a sense, there are two types of dominant females. There are the usual dominant females, which breed with a resident immigrant male. And then there are a relatively small proportion of dominant females that breed with visiting males from other groups. Parental care, the helpers, the subordinates engage in a wide range of cooperative activities. They help to go on duty on sentinel duty when the group is foraging. They help to dig burrows and clean them out. And when the dominant female produces her pups, they babysit them for a day at a time. So normally one, sometimes two individuals stay when the group go foraging. Each group has a range of 3 to 5 square kilometers. So they go quite long distances away they go quite long distances away in the course of the day. An individual stays to protect the pups, doesn't feed for 24 hours at a time, and loses several percent of their body weight during that time. The subordinate females quite commonly lactate to them, and then everyone during the first 3 months of pup life helps to feed pups by finding food and then giving them to pups when the pups are accompanying the group. And the whole group protects pups and protects each other from predators, and the whole group as a group will attack predators. So I've seen meerkat groups attack jackals, vastly larger than them. Social dynamics. Dominant females are succeeded by the oldest subordinate female in the group. Dominant males are immigrants or founding members of the group. Subordinate males emigrate by age 5, and dominant females evict subordinate females by the age of 5. So there are basically no subordinate females older than 4 or 5 years in any group. They've all gone, and they disperse, and they either found new groups or die. So about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 individual females that survive to adulthood get to breed as dominants at any stage in their lives. So why evict? Why do individuals evict? And the answer doesn't appear to be anything to do with food, because if we carry out controlled experiments and we feed dominant females, this doesn't reduce their tendency to evict subordinates. It actually increases it substantially, presumably because their sex hormones go up and they become more aggressive. Why evict? Well, the last thing, if you're a dominant female, you want is a pregnant subordinate when you produce pups, because pregnant females kill pups. So if there are several pregnant females in the group, then you have a very low chance of getting your pups away, and even one, even if you're the dominant female, is likely to kill pups. They're not shy about pups, but about the infant killing. Here's one that's brought up one of the pups and is busy killing it above ground. And this says something about the reasons why they throw out subordinates at age 5, because as you can see, the frequency of breeding attempts by subordinates increases. And once they reach the age of 4, most subordinates are trying to breed each year. Why don't helpers breed? Subordinates lack access. Most subordinates lack access to unrelated partners in the group, but they don't lack access to roving males. So they probably have less access to males, but not an entire lack of access. Dominance prevents subordinate reproduction by suppressing their development. They're regularly aggressive to them, and subordinates have lower estrogen luteinizing hormone levels, as I've already told you. They evict individuals that attempt to breed from their group. The subordinates commonly show high levels of abortions, and dominant females commonly kill their pups if they breed. And these are, of course, usually, or commonly, if not usually, these are their grand offspring. So we have a situation of sort of Little Red Riding Hood of the wolf, where the wolf is the grandmother. So why kill your grandchildren? Well, clearly you're more closely related to your children than your grandchildren. But it's also the case that other females breeding at the same time is associated with reduced growth, which is related to reduced survival of the pups of the dominant female. And we tried here an experiment where we, with Matt Bell, where we contracepted all the subordinate females. And when the subordinates were contracepted, we found, as we expected, that the dominant female's pups showed increased weight. So there's a link there between female infanticide and the growth and eventual breeding success of subordinates. However, dominant females don't always kill their pups. There's obviously a cost involved. They are their grandchildren, and dominant females are much more likely to spare them if they are not pregnant. So the killing of pups is particularly common if the dominant female is pregnant. Interestingly, too, dominant females have higher levels of testosterone, particularly in the latter part of the gestation period. And I think it's probably quite likely that testosterone is associated with infanticidal behavior in dominant females. Why don't helpers disperse? Well, this is relatively simple. There's a shortage of vacant territories. There's very high mortality risks of dispersal and low chances of breeding once established, and small groups rapidly, very small numbers of small groups survive and breed. And females never leave their home groups voluntarily. They're always thrown out by dominant females. We've never seen a female who voluntarily got up and left. So meerkats are known for helping. Cooperative breeders are known for helping. When we started with meerkats, the previous people who'd worked with them had been unable to find any effects of helpers on breeding success and tended to believe that there weren't any. And we found that that very much wasn't the case. So that as the number of helpers per group increases, the food intake rate measured in terms of numbers of prey that each pup finds goes up. The daily weight gain of pups goes up too. And if the danger with this situation is that the relationships of this kind could occur because there's an association between helper number and pup growth, and that is purely because both of them are associated with better territories. So there's a danger with correlational data like this that it may be the case that one finds these correlations because groups that live in good territories their pups have a high food intake rate, and pups turn into helpers, so they have more helpers per group. So there's no causal relationship. And we found we were able to manipulate the numbers of helpers and pups per group just temporarily for half a day at a time. And we did two things. We either took away, we most commonly manipulated litter size. So we found that we could reduce litters just simply by taking pups away, and thus increasing the ratio of helpers to pups when we reduced. And under those, when we did that to groups, the pups gained more weight where there were more helpers to pups. And then we found that we could actually introduce pups to other groups of the same age. The pups sometimes found this a bit strange, but the helpers took no notice and were happy to feed pups that had just been introduced, and the pups latched onto that. And if we increased numbers of pups, thereby reducing the helper-pup ratio, we found that the pups gain more rapidly in weight. So that, I think, produces direct evidence that there's a causal link between pup growth and the number of helpers. We went one stage further. We experimentally increased full food intake rate sufficiently to increase the weight of pups, pretending to be our helpers ourselves, giving, in that case, quite a lot of food. And if we fed pups, unsurprisingly, they showed greater weighted independence, and they subsequently showed a higher probability of surviving too. Helpers do other things as well. They reduce the workload of breeders. So the more helpers there are in the group, the workload of breeders comes down. The dominant female and the dominant male don't have to do so much work. And that's associated with increases in the breeding rate of dominant females. So it increases the probability of them producing and rearing more litters per year. Is there a division of labor? Anything similar to the social insects? The answer is that some helpers are more generous than others, but this isn't tied to specific forms of cooperation like pup feeding, or there aren't particular diggers, particular sentinels, or particular babysitters. There are positive correlations between the contribution of individuals to these different cooperative activities. So there are more generous individuals and less generous individuals, but there's no evidence of castes in meerkats, and I think actually very little evidence in other cooperative mammals either. So these big differences in the contributions of helpers, what causes them? Well, they don't appear to be heritable, or there are very low levels of heritability in the individual contributions to babysitting, pup feeding, or sentinel activities. This is work-based. This is using animal model techniques to estimate heritability using a multi-generational pedigree, which we've produced. And so the cooperative breeders, the cooperative contributions are slightly heritable, but is considerably less so than measures of growth or measures of size or so on. There's no evidence of nepotism. All the individuals in the group are close relatives, and there's no tendency for them to, there's no statistical tendency for them to feed close relatives more than distant relatives. And that's a common factor of many cooperative breeders. Most cooperative breeders are closely related to each other, so they tend not to show favoritism in that way. Who helps most? Females help a bit more than males. Female subordinates help a bit more than male subordinates, but it's not a great deal. It's a quantitative effect. Young adults help more than older adults, so that as the time of likely dispersal approaches, individuals tend to help less, particularly males who are already roving to other groups. Subordinates do more than dominants. Dominant females tend not to do much because they're suffering the costs of lactation. And particularly important, well-fed individuals do more. So if we look at the amount of pup feeding that individuals helpers do, that increases with their daily weight gain. So we were able to do the simple experiment to feed helpers and look at, if we feed a helper with hard-boiled egg, then they gave away a higher proportion of the food that they find. And that, I think, is an important issue here, because helping, it wasn't appreciated that helping was likely to be conditional. So helping is conditional. You don't do very much if you're starving. You do it if you've got enough food. And that effectively means that the fitness costs of helpers, the costs of helping to your own survival and your own breeding success, are likely to be relatively low. And I think in most of these systems, it is the case that helping is conditional. These inequalities, the effects of condition and food and sex and age, increase with helper number. So as there are more helpers, it becomes the case that there's not so much stress on individual helpers, and the individuals who are in not such a good case to help, where helping is likely to be a bit more costly to them, do relatively less, and inequality increases. And in extreme cases, so the extreme cases of free riding tend to increase with helper number 2. So why don't these cheat? Why don't we get individuals? Why don't individuals cheat? Why don't they avoid cooperation? Well, part of it, as I've suggested, is probably because helping is comparatively cheap. It's not something that for most individuals has a major effect on their fitness. But it's also the case that helpers and group size is very important for everyone. So the size of groups is very important in keeping the neighbors at bay. The groups are in continuous semi-warfare with each other. They form incursions onto each other's ranges. They go patrolling into each other's ranges. They look for the breeding burrows of pups. And if they find breeding burrows, normally with a single babysitter, they attack them and do their best to kill the pups. So there's extensive intergroup infanticide. And small groups lose out and are continuously pushed away from their ranges. Members of large groups show reduced mortality. So there are probably lots of reasons for that: increased workload, increased chances of losing your territory, less sentinel care, and so on. But small group size is costly to everyone's fitness. It's also the case that the benefits of group size affect dispersal and your probability of dispersing successfully. So only big groups can produce big splinters. Splinter groups, the males or females, are those that are leave together, and splinter size is very important in the probability of establishing a new group. Individuals in larger dispersing splinters lose less weight during the dispersal stage, and they show lower cortisol levels. That as the size of splinter groups declines, so the cortisol levels sky. Females are more likely to, lone individuals leaving on their own very seldom survive and very seldom establish groups. Pairs and trios are about the same, but actually we don't find them often, but the very large groups of breeding females when they leave are the most successful in setting up new breeding groups. And in males too, there's a relationship between the numbers of individuals leaving at any one time and the probability that they'll start a new group. The effects of group size on breeding success, on sentinel duty, and all these things have a substantial effect on the responses on the success of individuals, and that particularly applies during periods of low rainfall or high temperatures. Adverse environments, in adverse environments like the bottom below, this is the review from my house in a year of high rainfall and a year of low rainfall. When rainfall is low, there's very little food around, they're having to work very hard, and group size mitigates the effects of differences in temperature and rainfall on adult body size and weight, on female fecundity, on litter size, and on pup growth. And this is quite probably the reason why cooperative breeders are most commonly found in deserts, in in adverse environments, unstable environments, as in birds, as Dustin Rubinstein and Jets showed in birds, and as Dieter Lucas and I showed in mammals. And the persistence of groups is strongly affected by size, particularly in the smaller ranges, so that in the smaller ranges of group size, the probability of groups going extinct in the course of the year skies. And when a group goes extinct, that's an extinction of a whole pile of relatives, so that there's major losses to everyone, both in terms of their own direct fitness, but also in terms of their indirect fitness. So how do we see the evolution of these systems? This is the monogamy hypothesis, which Boomsma produced in 2009, but which lots of other people have suggested too. If you think about the situation from Ego's point of view, you're a subordinate. Do you want to breed yourself, or do you want to help your parents breed? You are the offspring of the same father and mother, so that your sisters and brothers that they produce will be 0.5 related to. You will tend to prefer to produce your own offspring in many situations, but the costs of stopping breeding and rearing your mother's offspring will be ameliorated if your mother is much more likely to breed successfully than you are. So if in many of these situations, if your mother is much more likely to rear young successfully than you're going to, that comes into the equation. If it's the case that your mother is likely to evict you if you breed, then you're likely to do that. Then that will come into the equation too. If you are likely to, by breeding, if you're likely to suppress the breeding of your mother or to affect that, that's likely to be important too. So I think that what's actually happening is that there's a balance of indirect benefit versus direct benefit in these systems, and that where kinship is very high and the differences in potential breeding between dominants and subordinates are relatively marked, it's quite often worth the subordinates' while not breeding themselves and helping the dominant breeder to breed instead. And that's how you get the evolution of singular breeding. So it's interesting, there's one mongoose, which are banded mongooses, where all the females breed each year, and there's no evidence of suppression. And if you look here, their levels of average relatedness are much lower than species like meerkats or dwarf mongooses, where there's reproductive suppression. Helping occurs in both, but in banded mongooses, it's males that help and females don't help. So it's only a guess, but the likely situation, I think, is that banded mongooses are derived from a system of this kind. They have formed big groups. They live in relatively mesec environments. And with increases in group size has come a reduction in average relatedness. And in those circumstances, it's not worth females suppressing themselves and basically putting their efforts into indirect benefits, into helping their parents. And just to remind you, this goes back to the point that all the cooperative breeders show these very high levels of relatedness between group members compared to social breeders. And it's not that these social breeders, it's not that there's no female competition in these social breeders. Commonly there's a lot, but the competition doesn't get to a point where it generates infertility and reproductive suppression in subordinates in the females. So my guess is that the differences in relatedness between cooperative breeders and social breeders play a major role in the evolution of cooperative breeding systems. In the final bits of the talk, I want to say something quickly about the consequences of cooperative breeding. In these, there's very high variance in breeding success because dominant females can produce large numbers of offspring during their lifetime. So meerkats, the most females can produce 150 babies in their lifetime. Mole rats, they can produce 600 babies, surviving infants during their lifetime. And that leads to high variance in breeding success. So that our most successful female meerkat has produced 80 babies in her lifetime, compared to most successful red deer stag ever, who's only done 35 offspring in his lifetime. So there's huge variance in breeding success among females. That's generated lots of intense competition between females, very high levels of aggression between female meerkats. High competition like that has led to a number of adaptations. Females show high levels of testosterone. They're as high as those in males, which is uncommon. And they show quite a syndrome of traits which are male-like. They're commonly big, they're commonly fierce. There's a very nice paper by looking at Swiss fighting cattle, if anyone's not seen this, where the Swiss have bred female cattle for fighting for about 100 years, and they now have produced cows that look very like bulls, that have high levels of aggression, high testosterone levels, and very low milk yields. Instead of castes, cooperative mammals have evolved opportunistic strategies, so they have very flexible growth. So when a new immigrant male comes into a group, with the result that there are all the subordinate females have the capacity to breed with him, they increase their growth rate and they wind up their reproductive systems. So when an immigrant male comes in, the subordinate females start to increase their growth rate. And this leads to interesting adaptations. So basically the females are in a queue. They're all standing there hoping someone will come and eat their mother. And then if someone eats their mother, there's an opportunity for them to breed, which is usually taken by the oldest dominant female, the oldest subordinate female who replaces the female. But what you don't want under these situations is your younger sister outgrow you, because if she outgrows you, she'll take your place in the queue and then you'll never get to breed. So that's what you don't want. So what do you do about it? Well, if your younger sister starts to grow, you try and beat her. So we did a competitive growth experiment with Elise Huchard. We identified pairs of subordinate females that are ranked neighbors. We fed the younger and lighter subordinate, and we compared their growth and foraging success between challenged ones whose younger sisters were breed. We compared the growth and foraging success of individuals who were challenged by having younger sisters who had been fed by us versus controls whose ranked neighbor wasn't fed. What we found was that individuals that weren't fed themselves, but whose younger sisters were fed, showed an increase in body weight, and they tended to eat more food per day. In breeders, the duration, your lifetime breeding success depends on how long you hold the dominant role for. How long you get to hold the dominant role for is related to your relative weight compared to your closest competitor. You're better off if you're a lot heavier than your closest competitor. If you're very much the same weight, or if you're lower, it's more likely that she'll displace you. What do you do when you get to the dominant position? In full adulthood, the subordinate that gets to the dominant position then winds up its growth rate, and over the next 3 months shows a period of rapid growth and then stabilizes at a greater weight. And Elise found one other quirk in this, that the amount of group, the amount of extra weight you put on during that period is related to the difference in weight between you and the heaviest subordinate in the group, so that you increase your weight substantially in that situation, or relatively substantially in the situation, if you're very similar in weight to the heaviest subordinate, and your increase in weight declines if you're already a substantial amount heavier. To what extent, I've told you about meerkats, to what extent do these sorts of differences apply in the other cooperative breeders? My impression is that it's quite likely that many of these factors apply in many of these species, that many of them show physiological suppression of males and females. They typically show high skew and high mate fidelity in both sexes. There's disagreement as to whether they're monogamous, and we can discuss that later, but the evidence looks to me as if in all these species there's the high differences in breeding success in both sexes. They typically show high kinship and help us increase the survival of juveniles and often have an effect on female fecundity too. And for subordinates, my temptation is to think that the indirect benefits of foregoing breeding probably exceed the direct benefits of attempting to breed in a lot of these cases. But not all the suggested correlates of cooperative breeding are there. It's not the case in cooperative breeders, as some people have suggested, that birth weights are unusually high. It's not the case that juvenile dependence is unusually long. There's no evidence of improved cognitive abilities and no evidence of increases in relative brain size. So if you look at cooperative breeders tend to be specialists. They're not particularly clever. So I'd leave you with one thought, that if you're changing your house insurance or your car insurance, and you're tempted to go and ask an animal, don't go and ask a meerkat. Find your friendly neighborhood baboon. They're much better, they're much more likely to give you sensible advice. And with that, I'd like to briefly thank all the people who have collaborated to this, who've done so much work. Marta Manser, who's worked on communication for many years, Dave Gaynor, who's run the study site, Ben Dancer, who's worked on hormones, Elise Huchard, who's done the work on competitive growth, Dieter Lucas, who's been involved with me in comparative studies, Constance Dubuc, who's off my sheet, who's worked on subordinate growth, Dom Cram, who's worked on a variety of things, particularly on aging, Chris Duncan, and the people who are currently working, Chris Duncan, who's worked on the survival of groups, Frank Greenwood, who's worked on weather effects, Tom Housley, who's done the work that I told you about on heritability, Jack Thorley, who's worked on mole rats, but also on growth and development, Shay Rotex, who's done the work on inequalities, and Mark Dibble, who's done the work on kinship. And I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Tim, for a really great and fascinating talk. It was really a great start into the spring term of fine. Just for the people who will not stay for the entire discussion, we will have another fascinating talk next week by Susan Perry about her work on white-faced capuchins. But now I'm going to start the session of questions. And to ask a question, you have to type a question mark into the chat. Then I will call on you. And when I call on you, please first quickly say your name and where you're coming from so we know you. For the people on Facebook, I see there are still 79 people also watching on Facebook. You can write your questions into the chat function there, and we will try, one student of ours will try to bring this here into the Zoom meeting. But I see there's many questions coming in, and we might not be able to address all of them. But now let me see. Yeah, I have to scroll up. So the first question, please, comes from Michael Taborski.
Yes, thanks very much, Tim, for this wonderful overview of the fantastic, amazing work you and your group have done, especially on the Meerkats. I have a very simple question. I mean, given what you told us about the reproductive monopoly of female Meerkats, and especially the fact that they apparently kill their grand offspring, what keeps Meerkats to fall short of developing eusociality? What is the major reason you think they have not made this last step towards eusociality? They are on the verge, more or less.
Okay, but can I take you to me meaning by eusociality? Why they haven't evolved sterility?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Lifelong sterility.
Obligate sterility. Well, I think the answer is that in the animals that have evolved sterility, everyone's fate is decided from an early age. It's decided by how they're reared.
Mm-hmm.
With meerkats, what's actually happening, and I think with most of these systems, no one knows whether they're going to be a breeder because there's a huge random element in it. What happens, your chances of becoming a breeder if you're a female meerkat depend very strongly on whether someone eats your mother when you are the oldest subordinate female. So you have this narrow window when you are, if the resident dominant dies, you will take over. And no one knows whether they're going to be able, whether that is going to be their fate or not. You can't displace your mother. You've got to wait and hope that someone will eat her. And that's a chance event. So in that situation, once you get to what you've developed instead is a system where you adjust your growth, where you adjust your development when you get to the dominant breeding position. It wouldn't be worth your while to go sterile and become a specialized helper because no one knows what their chances of getting to be a breeder are, and it's not closely related to your phenotype.
Mm. So even if they have a very small chance, you're saying even if they have a very small chance to be a successful breeder, they take their chance?
Well, everyone has a roughly similar chance.
Mm.
Do you see?
It's not biased, yeah.
Whereas, I mean, as you get, that's, I think, not the only thing. The other aspect of it is in the social insects, the colony sizes are huge. So even if there's even if it's a chance event, for any one individual, your chances of taking over the role are very small.
Mm.
And this is Burke's explanation of why you get full sterility in social insects, that as colony size goes up, that the colony size will lead to divergent selection pressures on breeders and non-breeders. But I think I think in most of the vertebrates, it's the case that there's a major, no one knows, no one has a good idea whether they're going to get to be a breeder or not.
Mm.
So you don't take any, it's not worth your while suppressing entirely. Does that?
So the lack of asymmetry in the chances, that's the point.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much.
Interesting question.
So the next question comes by Eleanor Crooks, please.
Hi, really good talk. I'm a second year student at the University of Derby, and I don't know if I missed this, but do subordinates only kill pups when they're close to their 5-year eviction? Or is there some research into why they would do this otherwise? Because why won't they just become helpers? I know you mentioned that dominance will kill subordinates if they're pregnant, subordinates pups if they're pregnant. Is it a similar thing? Like, or is there no answer for the infanticide with the subordinates at this point?
Only pregnant females kill pups.
Right. Okay. So if the subordinate needs to be pregnant to kill the pup.
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, so I think the point is that if you're pregnant, what you don't want is anyone else in the group producing pups that are going to be slightly older than yours and will outcompete. So, so what sometimes happens when a new dominant female takes over, the subordinates take the opportunity and everyone gets pregnant. So you can have 6 pregnant subordinates, and they give birth in turn. And the first individual almost always gets her pups eaten by the next 5. The second one gets her pups eaten by the next 4, and so on down until only the last conceiver gets her pups away. And we were interested in trying to see whether there was any evidence that individuals tried to manipulate their birth date in order to be the last one to give birth.
Yeah.
We found some not very convincing evidence to that effect, but we're seriously interested. It would pay an individual to defer birth.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting. Thank you.
So the next question comes by Vincent Viplan, please.
Yes, thank you, Tim. I'm a researcher at the CNRS in Strasbourg in the same lab as Karsten, actually. So that was a fascinating talk, and it was really great to learn more about the social system of those animals. And so I have a question. I'm not really sure how to formulate it because I'm having trouble formulating it in my mind, but I'll give it my best shot. I found it really interesting that you showed that the animals would basically stop helping as much, stop feeding the pups as much if they were starving themselves. And you have a system where you have direct fitness benefits and indirect fitness benefits. And I'm trying to think about all this as an indirect cost of reproduction. And I'm wondering if it would be possible in some way to quantify the threshold where the direct and indirect benefits, well, where basically the indirect benefits wouldn't outweigh the direct benefits anymore in terms of survival, so that any cost in terms of not gaining weight to oneself would be offset by the cost of giving it to the offspring. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do see. The problem is, I think with meerkats, they're all highly related.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's difficult to manipulate that, and it's probably fixed. So we've done experiments with mole rats where we actually manipulate relatedness. And it's familiarity that matters, not relatedness.
Okay.
So I think my response to what you said, is it would be interesting to look at those thresholds in species with different levels of relatedness.
Yes. Yeah. Well, obviously, yes.
So if you could find 2, 3, 4 species with contrasts and relatedness, I would expect that threshold to occur at different levels. Yeah, but I have a nasty feeling that things like meerkats, they're animals that are adapted to living in high levels of relatedness, and they don't adjust to a short-term variation in relatedness.
Okay. Thank you.
And that plays out in the fact that there's no nepotism. I mean, if one look in social mammals, nepotism tends to be associated with high variance in relatedness. So if you go to the primate group, if you go to things like baboons, where there's low average relatedness, there's high variance in relatedness. So you have some dyads where individuals are closely related, others where they're entirely distantly related, and you then get nepotistic relationships.
Okay.
Thank you. Then we have the next question by Sari van Baal, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Sari van Baal and I'm affiliated. I'm a postdoc at the University of Texas in Austin, and I study black howler monkeys. I very much enjoyed your talk, and I would like some more insight into what you explained in that when the dominant female disappears, is eaten, next her oldest daughter takes over, or whomever is the biggest of the daughters. But then this daughter, so the new dominant female, does not necessarily have an unrelated male to whom to mate with. So I would then assume, as you told us, that they would mate with roving males, which would then, if they can put out 3 litters a year, I would assume that that is not always with the same roving male, which then would decrease the genetic relatedness amongst the group members, which would then play into the helpers investing into direct versus indirect benefit. And then I would think it could fall apart, their entire system, but it doesn't fall apart.
Something else happens.
What is the something else?
You haven't thought about the dominant male.
Okay.
So what happens after that? So if a predator eats the dominant female and the dominant male is left with a pile of his daughters, he goes away, he disperses and tries to find another breeding opportunity.
So in your entire story, you didn't really talk about males coming in and taking over that dominant position, but that happens.
I did mention that males were immigrants.
Yes,
so
but
males,
turnover of immigrants.
Unlike females, males would immigrate into groups, and they will sometimes, as in lions, evict residents from groups, and that's how that all happens. And you get these situations, as I did say, where the dominant male dies, where the dominant female is prevented from having another immigrant because her sons keep them out. And then you have a system where basically all the females breed outside. And interestingly, you occasionally get what we call natal dominant males. So you get one individual who is more dominant, doesn't fully occupy that position, but is dominant to all the other individuals. And they don't breed with the dominant female, but the benefit to them is that they retain their status when they emigrate. So they're much more likely to get a breeding opportunity elsewhere. But to me, it's interesting that the system that you get, where basically dominant females and subordinate females all breed outside, is exactly what you get in killer whales. So the shift from the kind of system that we're talking about here to a killer whale system isn't really that much. And so at any one time, 20 to 30% of our groups are actually having a killer whale system.
Interesting. Thank you.
Then I see Filippo already is getting ready for his question. Filippo, please.
Hi, team. As expected, a wonderful presentation of an incredible field-based project. Congratulations, but there was no really need for that, as everybody knows. First, I'd like to make a brief comment, and I would like from Tim having just probably a yes and no answer. And he said to remove a preconception about cooperation in general. It seems that the presentation and Tim's work show that a high degree of cooperation does not necessarily imply high affiliation or friendliness. It seems that the cooperative breeding in meerkats is based on dominance, aggression, suppression. correct?
Yes.
Okay, the next. Now, this I think is important because a lot of people think of cooperation, they are all friendly, but it's not true necessarily, at least not in this system. Now, the next one is that, the degree of manipulation, including food provision and close proximity between study subject and researcher are high, making possible the great research output that Tim presented. I wonder if you can comment on any indication or negative implication of the high contact between study subjects and researchers, or better evidence that there are no negative consequences due to such a high contact in terms of health and survival. In terms of possible disease transmitted by humans, is there any evidence for higher disease rate in highly studied groups than less studied groups, for example? And are provision groups larger, and so they perform better than neighboring non-provision groups?
Several answers there. Provision groups, we don't provision groups. I mean, in terms of getting our animals onto the scales, as I'm saying, as I said, we'll use a half an egg to weigh 30 animals.
Yes and no, because in some experiments you say that you on purpose, you fed them more to get weight.
Yeah.
Right?
There we are able to provision individuals. We don't provision groups. So we can provision one individual in the group, and we do that to a sufficient level to increase their growth. And there's no tendency for that to increase the group size. Is there, I mean, I almost always, to answer a question you didn't ask, but it must, I think, be there with lots of people, is the degree of habituation leading to unnatural behavior? Are they scared? And my reaction there is to say that the animals that are most affected by observers tend to be those which are worried about the presence of the observer. And our animals are not worried about our presence. The closest they come to it is if you've ever been to a party and you're talking to someone who's not interested in you at all, and is continuously looking over your shoulder to see what's going on in the room behind you. That's what meerkats are. So if you're close to them, they're often interested in what's going on behind
Jimmy, this is fine, but this is habituation. And my question was not habituation. Most of the work we do on getting the detail in a variety of species, the animals are habituated, so they ignore us. Yeah, clearly, in your case, there's a very high degree of close proximity. So my question was about transmission, disease transmission. There's any evidence?
There's no evidence that.
Perfect. That's the question. No, I didn't ask the habituation because I understand the benefits completely. It was more like to ask you if they were negative, and it seems that they are not. So perfect. That's basically.
Just one more thing. When we started, they get TB. And considerable. We lose about 1 or 2 groups to TB a year, and when we started, it was believed that that was human TB. And then it shifted, and the people, they told us it was bovine TB. And then it shifted again, and they told us it was rock hyrax TB. And then finally it shifted again, and they told us it was meerkat TB. And it's a specific TB. So I don't think they get stuff from us. It is also the case that the Kalahari is a very dry, very healthy environment.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So the next question is, and now that's a bit embarrassing, my Afrikaans isn't good enough, from Arlene Wischoen, please.
Hi, I'm an honors student from the University of Pretoria.
Hi,
and I have a question. Right, and is there maybe an increase in predation, or maybe an increase in probability that they might be predated upon because they're coming into this different territory, or maybe because there's a loss of pups and very stress that also comes upon that? Is there maybe even a slight effect of vulnerability to predators in that area? For the group that gets attacked?
When you were asking the question, you broke up. So it didn't come through. So can I just be clear? Are you asking, does our presence increase the chances of predation on the animals?
I was talking about the raiding parties when they raid the pups.
Okay.
The other Meerkat group, yes. Is there an increase in possible predation that has sort of effect? Because then also there's also slight, because of population dynamics in terms of predator and prey. Of course, there's like a loss in the population, so there's a small effect on the predators. So
yeah,
and then it has a bit of a more of a sort of a breathing gap for that group that they can just grow a bit bigger.
I don't know the answer to. We've never actually looked to see whether there's more predation on adults when there are pups about. There is higher predation on pups than anything else, particularly because they're taken by pale chanting goshawks quite commonly. There's much higher predation on dispersing individuals. Yeah, and when when we worked in the park, which was a major flyway with vast numbers of predators coming through and quite small groups, we did find very high predation rates in small groups because they had sentinels on duty for less of the time. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Then the next question comes by Suleima, please.
Yes, hi. Suleima Tang Martinez,
Suleima.
University of Missouri in St. Louis, retired. And actually, a lot of the questions I had were answered in the response to Sari's questions. But I do have a few more questions, and they all have to do with the male dispersal and the dynamics of male dispersal. So in the females, it sounds like emigration occurs because the females are evicted by the dominant. So question number one is, what happens around the time of male immigration? Are they also evicted, or are they leaving on their own? So that's question number one. Then question number two is, are the dominant, the groups with no male dominance that you talked about when you answered Sari's questions, are those permanent groups with no dominant male where the females go out and mate with roaming males, or can they switch back to having a dominant male? And then sort of related to that, if subordinate males, in cases like you described where the female dies, the dominant female dies, the breeding female dies, if the subordinate males are keeping other males from entering the group, then how do groups ever get immigrant males, breeding males? Are immigrant males only coming into groups that do not have subordinate males, or how does that happen? And a great talk, by the way, really nice.
To answer that in order, the males emigrate of their own accord. They're not thrown out. And emigration, in a sense, is a lengthy process, because when they're about 2.5 years old, they start going on social forays, where they go and visit other groups and try and mate with subordinate females and get chased away. And it's quite a dangerous affair, because if the resident males catch them, they will kill them. So they go through a sort of party phase where they go and visit people in other groups. Where you get a natal male developing like this, the natal male also goes visiting other groups because he doesn't have anyone to mate with at home, and he eventually stays away or his number's up and someone catches him. And when subordinate males keep other males out, a couple of things may happen. It may get to be the case that they're away for a day, visiting people in other groups, and males from other groups move into their group and they come home and they find that someone else is sitting there in their armchair, and they don't contest it. Sometimes other males arrive and throw them out, and sometimes they disperse of their own accord. But we tend to think that, although it's certainly the case that sentinel activity is useful for keeping an eye out for predators, males do it a bit more than females. And we think males keep a very close eye on the local neighborhood talent and are very interested in other groups too.
Thanks. I had observations many years ago on prairie dogs in which male prairie dogs that were attempting to enter a group where the breeding male had disappeared. This is all very subjective, obviously, but my impression was that they almost seemed to try to interact with pups and ingratiate themselves with the pups. The females would chase off the male that was trying to enter, but over time of his coming in to the territory and interacting usually in the periphery with pups and playing with pups, it was almost as if the females seemed to habituate to the male, and so eventually they let him in. Do you see anything like that going on with the meerkats?
No, I've not seen. That rings a bell with me, with baboons doing the same thing and dispersing baboons, making friends with juveniles and subordinates on their way to get into the group. My impression is, no, I don't see anything like that. I think meerkats are pretty simple animals. So I tend to think of them, it's difficult to think of them as compared to primates, they're not very clever. They're specialists in one particular way and they're good at that, but they don't have the kind of awareness of primates at all. And Alex Thornton has basically tried a variety of cognitive tests on meerkats, and they really performed pretty badly. And where I've seen them dealing with predators, they commonly do the most stupid things. So I tend not to, there's this interest in cooperative breeding and cognitive development, which is coming out of anthropology because of the interest in cooperation with humans. And there's a tendency for that argument to suggest that cooperative breeders should be super bright. And I think that, I'm quite happy that cooperation was vitally important with humans. I'm happy that it perhaps generated selection for cognitive development and all that. But it's not the case that cooperative breeders show high levels of cognitive development I believe.
Okay, thank you very much. Great talk.
So the next question comes by Adriana, please.
Hi, Adriana Maldonado Chaparro from Universidad del Rosario, Colombia. Thanks, Tim, for this talk. I'm wondering about the evicted females. So I have two questions about them. The first one is, well, you told us that single females are less likely to form new groups, right? So I'm assuming that when the dominant females evicts a subordinate females, she will go on her own. So most likely she will need to join a new group. What's the probability of her joining a new group? And if that happens, will she be a dominant female in that new group, or she'll get in a subordinate state?
Yeah.
Or the probability, maybe it's very low. And the second one refers to the group size. So would it be, I don't know if there's a group size in which the dominant females give up on evicting older subordinate females and just let them breed, or they will always have control of reproduction?
Yeah, okay. The straightforward evicted females, emigrating females, are never allowed to join other breeding groups. So, and secondly, they do actually, it's commonly the case that the dominant evicts several daughters at the same time, and that they go off together. Yeah, but they never join, even if there are several. I think we've never seen them displace the dominant female from a breeding group. And that's because the splinter groups of females are always smaller than the residents, and all members of a group, both males and females, will drive them out.
I see.
So,
So will that mean, sorry, will that mean that the evicted females, if they encounter another group that is about this similar size, will they join?
No, they'll never join.
Never?
They'll fight it. I mean, it's usually the case that resident groups are bigger than any splinter. Yeah, so they normally chase splinters away. Yeah, I think. I mean, I can't think of a case where a splinter group has displaced an actual resident group. Resident groups sometimes displace each other. So bigger groups displace smaller groups. But the splinter groups are smaller than that. And no, dominant females keep evicting subordinates at all levels. There's, if anything, a slight tendency, or possibly a slight tendency, for them to be more likely to evict when group size is bigger. And they probably don't have such a need of helpers. But it's all complicated by changes by relationships between group size and age. So the bigger groups are normally ones where or commonly ones where the dominant female has been a dominant female for some time.
So then you have more age structure within the group.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, good. Thank you.
So the next question comes by Martina Along.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Carson. Yeah, I'm Martina. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at UC Berkeley in the United States. And I really enjoyed your talk. I read some of your work for my qualifying a couple of years ago, so it's really cool to hear some more about it more recently. And I'm wondering specifically about potential physiological costs of dominant females. So you mentioned that they reproduce 1 to 4 litters every year. And so I thought it might be a cool comparison to look at implications for physiological damage on their body as a result of that, or survival or long-term lifespan compared to subordinate females.
The more litters they produce, the tireder they get. I mean, if you can, so that during the course of the year, they start losing, where they lose weight in successive litters. And that's particularly the case if they have relatively few helpers and they have to do a lot themselves. So that they very seldom produce 4 litters, it's usually 1 to 3. But pups born in the 3rd litter are usually smaller and suffer higher mortality than those born in the first 2. We suspect, I can't cite firm evidence here, but we're interested in the possibility that one of the costs of having 3 litters is you're more likely to be evicted by subordinate females. Dominant females are sometimes displaced and evicted by the heaviest subordinate female. And you don't want, if you're a dominant, to be in a situation where your eldest daughter is heavier than you are. So, you know, there is a risk there. I don't think we've got evidence. I mean, I'm aware of evidence from other things with red deer and sow sheep in particular, of reduced longevity in relation to high levels of fecundity and particularly early fecundity in the lifespan. So I should think that something like that is going on. But whether we would pull it out, there's so much random mortality, there's so much predation mortality with us, 25% a year, that is quite likely to mask events like that. It's something we should look at, but I don't know whether it would come out.
Yeah. Are you able to even quantify thing like their immune capacity as a result, like, you know, females who are producing 3 litters versus 1 litter, or the subordinate female, even oxidative damage from the blood samples that you collect?
Yes, we are able to do that. We haven't done it, is the answer. We have a vet coming who's interested in that, but if anyone else is interested, we'd be interested in collaborating. We keep huge banks of fecal samples. So we have fecal samples we have quite large numbers of fecal samples from individuals going back for getting on for 30 years.
Amazing.
And occasionally we've done a number of experiments with that. There's someone who came and presented them with the smells of their ancestors. So,
that's cool.
There are a number of things like that. We also collect blood regularly, so that I think things like that could well be done, but we haven't done it so far. But if anyone wants to come in and would be interested in analyzing a substantial amount of that kind of data, we have it there. It's all frozen and or dried in the case of feces, and the opportunity is there.
All right, thanks for your time.
So the next question comes by Antoinetta Cutromani, please.
Hello, Antoinetta Cutromani here. I am a master student from Wageningen University. And my question is about the slide that you showed the roles that the helpers can take. And one of them was lactation. And it struck me as odd because usually for a female to lactate, she needs to have babies. So what's the situation with this particular species?
Quite commonly, quite a high proportion of females that lactate are individuals who've either aborted or had their babies killed. Yeah, so there's quite a high proportion of those there. There's a discussion around, they're more likely to lactate. A French student called Morgan Brachet has shown they're more likely to lactate if they have bred before. But it does look as if sometimes we see lactation in individuals that have not been known to get pregnant before. Okay. So it's possible that there'll be some form of spontaneous lactation there. It's always very difficult because one can't be sure that they haven't had a pregnancy, which we haven't detected. We can only detect, we know since we weigh everyone, we know pretty precisely what the pattern of weight gain is. And there's very little weight gain in the first half of pregnancy. So we can't pick up what's happening to females during the first half of pregnancy. We can't recognize those as pregnant. We could if we regularly sampled everyone and we did it hormonally, but we haven't done that, or at least we haven't analyzed the data yet. So we can only tell about the second half of pregnancy, and we don't know whether a proportion of the individuals that look as if they're spontaneous lactators are individuals that have actually got pregnant in the past but lost their fetuses in the first half of their gestation.
That's very interesting because it could have implications on infanticide and what happens to the teethers with the dominant males. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Next question comes from Leah Prox.
Hi all, very inspiring talk. Thank you very much. I hope my internet connection is stable enough. I've been struggling a little bit. So yeah, I'm Leah Prox. I'm a PhD student from Peter Kappler's lab at the German Primate Center. And I was wondering, building up a little bit on Saris and Suleyma's question about those killer whale groups. So I didn't get if you answered how stable those groups are and how long they persist, and what environmental or maybe even social conditions with other groups would maybe even be favorable for groups where they've got males coming from outside instead of a dominant male.
The answer is the groups don't last long.
What was that? Sorry.
The answer is that the groups with natal males don't last long, because the natal males normally leave at the next breeding season. So it depends how long they last, depends what time of year this occurs. Yeah. And the fact that we have quite a number of groups in that category at any one time basically reflects the relatively high chance of everyone being killed. So there's high mortality, which means that there's a relatively high frequency of groups where the dominant male is being killed. The dominant female doesn't have an unrelated male in the group, and so everyone breeds outside. But her sons are likely to do, if her sons are old enough to keep out the opposition, they're probably already roving, and they'll rove and move away at the next breeding attempt. So it's a temporary position, whereas killer whales, it's a permanent position. But I think it's just to me, it was quite an interesting realization that there was such a close similarity, and that you could get a shift in the sort of immigration composition leading to a killer whale type society.
Very interesting, thank you.
So the next question comes by Irene Garcia Ruiz.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask that since there seems that there is a big influence of the group size, if higher relatedness might be just a consequence of limited dispersal, and then if it could help evolve due to an alternative mechanism to kin selection, like group augmentation or both in synergy.
Well, to answer, I think group augmentation is important, and I think group augmentation probably helps to stop cheating. Yeah. Is it the case that lack of dispersal leads to high kinship? Yes, I think that is just it's the tendency for dominant females to be replaced by a daughter. Obviously, helps to maintain the kinship, but it's other factors too. So it's much easier to get high levels of kinship where you have monogamy. Yeah, it's much easier to get high levels of kinship where females produce litters. So you get a whole brood of full sibs. Yeah, it's very difficult to get high levels of kinship in monotocous breeders that produce single young, and it's very difficult to get high levels of kinship with a polygynous breeding system. So I think the residence is important, but it's not the only thing that's generating the high levels of kinship.
But that does imply that is the cause of help? Not necessarily, right? That there is high levels of kinship. That the reason that why they help is for sure favored by kinship, but it's not necessarily the reason why both helped.
Oh, no, I think that they come from an environment where helping is particularly important. So there's an association between cooperative breeding and unpredictable adverse environments, and cooperative breeding is much commoner there. But that doesn't for example, explain why cooperative breeding has occurred in calatrichines. They're living in comparatively mesic environments. I don't think we necessarily understand that, but they do, of course, produce 2 young, and they breed quite frequently. So I guess in calatrichines, there's quite a need for individuals other than the parents to help rear young in order to effectively permit the female to breed frequently, or putting that a better way around. There are potential benefits to individuals helping because they're A, closely related, and B, they can actually contribute to the fitness of close relatives.
Thank you.
So the next question comes by Eduardo.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, so much for a wonderful talk. I thought I was asking to ask a question very readily, but by the time I typed my question mark, it gave me 40 minutes to ponder on what to ask you of the gazillion questions I have, and to kind of overcome the overwhelming feeling of limitations we experience when we work with arboreal primates after listening to your talk. So first I want to comment, since you just were talking about the calatrichids, thanks for sharing with such a large, broadly comparative audience your view that cooperative breeders, to your understanding, are not necessarily of high cognitive abilities. I mean, you've shared with us information on the Meerkats, Thornton, and you were citing him. Not only there seems to be no evidence for that in Meerkats, but even for the calatrichids. I mean, you were mentioning anthropologies. The truth is that that has been an idea, but Thornton, with some colleagues, including myself and Paul Garber, who has studied cooperative breeding primates all his life, there is no evidence to support that idea. So for our younger colleagues in the audience, this is one of those situations where ideas get mixed with evidence. The idea may be interesting, but I'm totally with you that the evidence doesn't seem to be there, that the calatrichids show any kind of higher than expected cognitive abilities. So please check Thornton, Alex's work, because it's quite instructive. And then going back again to, you were talking about the calatrichids, can you help me think? I mean, I work with peer living taxa, and so you just have one male, one female, for those of you who are not familiar with our system of work, primates, and the young do not help. We have no helpers. And so you were saying that you see cooperative breeding with high coefficients of relatedness. We have come to realize that, at least in the owl monkeys that we study, because members of the pair get replaced, then it is quite possible that if you're a youngster in the group, now suddenly you're not really sharing the group with full siblings anymore, but with half siblings or even reduced coefficient of relatedness. So if I'm following your thinking, for some of the other pair living taxa that we have not really yet properly assessed, but where we just have one male, one female, and the siblings not helping at all, the prediction, I mean, once we get to doing those genetics, that you would expect that we will find that again, maybe there's more replacing of adults and therefore lower relatedness that we're assuming when we look at these groups, and we assume that mom and dad are there continuously.
Yeah.
Do I follow your thinking?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it would be very interesting to know what the levels of relatedness are in a number of the pair-living monogamous species like owl monkeys. I think one doesn't necessarily expect relatedness under those circumstances, because I think you're likely to get helping under those circumstances, because I think helping is more likely to occur where there's a substantial benefit. And if our monkeys are living, I mean, I take your basic point, which is high levels of turnover will reduce relatedness and will reduce the chances of the evolution of helping. But I think there is an additional issue that unpredictable environments and harsh conditions are quite likely also to increase the benefits of helping. And so I think it's not just kinship. This is the B and C ratio in Hamilton's equation. And the environmental component, I think, is important. It'll affect the B of the BC ratio. But I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's a really interesting question to ask which pair living monogamous species have given, which radiations of pair living cooperative have given rise to cooperative breeders and which haven't.
Thank you.
So the next question comes by Dustin Rubenstein.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for a great talk.
Hi, Dustin. Nice to hear you.
I have two questions. One sort of follows up on Eduardo's, I guess, and one some of the other things you said. They're both related to relatedness. One thing that's always struck me about your system is that these groups go extinct relatively frequently because of drought and because of TB and things like that. I'm just wondering the mechanism by which new groups form. Do they form from these splinter groups of females forming new groups? And then if so, do you see genetic structure between groups on the landscape, sort of this kin neighborhood idea that you see in a lot of birds? Do you also see that as a function of the extinction of these local groups in the meerkats?
We're looking at that at the moment. And the answer is yes, to some extent, but they're quite mobile. So this is a low density system. And as I say, the groups have ranges of 3 to 5 square kilometers. So, you know, compared to, well, a lot of other mammals, but also compared to quite a lot of birds, we're dealing with quite a wide ranging area. And there are interesting things happening which we're not fully on top of. So every now and then groups get up and move, and they can move several kilometers, bang, more or less, you know, in the course of 2 or 3 days. In fact, I've seen one in the park that moved 15 kilometers, bang. We're interested in why that's the case. We sort of tend to think that it must be something to do with the neighbors getting on top of you, because neighbors threaten your breeding burrows and kill your pups. But we're not there yet. We don't know what causes these movements. But I think the system is, I think we'll find some spatial structuring, but not an enormous amount.
And then my second question is sort of about the end. You sort of joked that you know, meerkats are maybe not the brightest relative to, say, a savanna baboon. And I'm wondering, you know, given all the controversy with the brain size and cooperation stuff in the literature, has anybody looked in mammals as a function of the average relatedness of the social groups that the species form and brain size? Because you might imagine that if you're with, you know, with relatives, you may not need as much cognitive capacity, but you're a bunch of unrelated individuals in larger groups, then you may see, you know, singular breeding species and plural breeding species having very different patterns as they relate to brain size.
Lucas and Clutton-Brock, 2018.
Okay, I missed that one. I will go.
The higher, very small sample. I don't know really whether I believe it, but the brain size increases as your average kinship declines. And if you put group size in, kinship replaces group size.
Okay.
But it's a small size. I really don't want to sort of place too much on that. But I think it's an interesting issue as to whether the relationships that people have talked about so much between kinship and group size are actually driven by a relationship between kinship, between low kinship and large brain size.
Thank you.
Okay, we are getting close to 1 hour of discussion, but there's still time for some questions, especially we will also get to the one on YouTube, which will be a few questions, I guess. But the next question is by Charlotte, please.
In fact, my 2 questions have already been answered, so I don't have any other question, but thanks for this very interesting talk.
Thanks, Charlotte. Nice to meet you.
Okay, then we move on to Jingyu, and she is presenting the questions from YouTube, and she also has one question by herself.
Oh, hello, I'm Jingyu from the University of Salzburg. So I have one question of myself. So, my question is: can female recognize their own pups?
Not very. I think so to some extent. When we introduce pups, the female, when we've introduced pups to other groups, the female is the breeding female is the only one that starts being suspicious. So I think that there is an issue. However, it is the case that every now and then the pups in the course of group interactions, pups get mixed up and end up with the wrong group. I don't think with us that that's intentional kidnapping. I think it's just a melee, and they go, and then they accept them and bring them up. So I think the answer is possibly, but not very efficiently.
Okay, so does it mean that the pregnant female would kill pups of other females? So if they can't recognize their own pups very well, so do they stop this infanticide after they have gave birth to their own cubs? Yes, they don't. We've never known them to kill their own pups. They do. Everyone goes and has a good time killing neighbors' pups. Okay, thank you. But then there's no problem. They find a burrow with a babysitter there, and it smells of their neighbors, and they all pack in and go for a spree in that way. But they don't kill their own pups. And pup infanticide, which I didn't say actually, infanticide within a group only occurs during the first 3 days of pup life. So by the time pups are 3 or 4 days old, I don't know what the trigger is, whether it's an olfactory trigger, but after that they're safe. Okay, thank you. So I have 2 questions from YouTube. So Manjari from India asks, why don't males kill grand cubs, or do they? Males don't kill grand cubs. You don't get male infanticide basically because there's a propartum estrus. So as far as a male goes, there's no point killing pups in order to induce pregnancy, to advance pregnancy in females, as is the case in primates. Yeah, because there's a postpartum estrus, what happens is you have no effect on the female. You might ask why males don't kill pups, because there might be some danger if they're grand offspring, but all I can say is they don't. We don't know of any cases with us of male infanticide. Okay, and the last questions from YouTube. Lapus asks that if subordinates manage to reproduce, is there a correlation between the rank of the mothers and the likelihood of a pup becoming dominant later? The straightforward answer is I don't know if that's the case. We haven't asked that because what we don't get is the sort of primate situation where there are several matrilines within the group which are competing with each other and which have an effect on pup growth and pup dominance and so on. So I think the answer is I don't know about that, but I would doubt it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Then we have 2 more questions. And the second last one comes from Alex Georgiev, if I pronounce it correctly.
Hello, hi, I'm Alex Georgiev at Bangor University in Wales. Amazing talk, but actually my question is about something you said in the Q&A just earlier. You talked about 3 decades worth of fecal samples and how someone did an experiment by showing the meerkats the smell of their ancestors. So just wondering what happened when they did that.
These weren't ancestors so much as ghosts. So they were individuals that were dead, but which were no longer in the group. And there was some evidence that they were quite strongly interested in them. We didn't do it on a big scale, and it was done some time ago. So, but I think it's an interesting, anyone interested in cognitive developments, it's an interesting thing to do. Might well be worth doing more of that. There was some indication that it worked, and that they showed more attention to them than to individuals that were already around in the group.
Brilliant, thank you.
And then last but not least, Nancy.
Thank you, Carsten. Wonderful talk, Tim.
Hi, Nancy.
Could you follow up telling us a little more about the pups from the two different types of social groups? So the ones that you said are killer whale-like versus the ones with the dominant male still present and the dominant breeding pair. Is there a difference in survival and reproduction of pups?
No, there's no difference. The dominant female finds the dominant female mates quite happily. There's no reduction in her fecundity.
Okay. I'm just blown away by the.
You might expect it to be, but we have looked at that. You know, you put your finger on something that immediately concerned us, and no, there's no difference. There are enough visitors to go round.
Okay, great. I am blown away by the amount of information you know about these animals. I guess if I spend another 20 years or something.
Well, I think an awful lot of that is down to the fact that we have quite a number of volunteers. So we take in people who've done a degree in biology and want field experience, and we only take them in for a year. We only take people in who do it for a year. And so we have, at any one time on the Meerkat project, we have somewhere around 12 people like that. So we're visiting large numbers of groups each day, and we have quite a lot of manpower, womanpower in the situation, which enables us to do that. And the only other thing I'd say, because it's a practical thing which has affected us, is that, and I've always been so glad, in 2001, the South African rand had fallen through the floor, and I suddenly realized that we could afford to buy our study area. So we bought our study area, and we own almost all of our study area. And that's meant that we can put up accommodation for lots of people. And it's meant that we have control of the situation. And it's been, sort of, in organizational terms, an absolutely crucial factor in the success of the project.
So now I know what I got to do.
Now you know what you've got to do. Buying your study area is a wonderful thing. I suppose the other point that came through, which we were very lucky with, someone turned up on my email and said, Tim, I want to make a 13-part series on meerkats. And I said, no, you're joking. No one will watch it. Go away. And they came back and said, no, we really do want to do it. So I sort of said, well, okay, we can arrange that. So they did it, and they made a 13-part series. And then they made 3 more 13-part series because they got an audience of 56 million. And
some people think that's going to happen with the voles.
Well, I did wonder, but I mean, if you could, but it might with water voles, I think.
They're harder to see. Yeah. Ours are harder to see. So, anyways, thank you again.
So yes, thank you very, very much, Tim, for really a great talk. It was amazing for all of us, but I would also like to thank the audience for this lively discussion. And I would especially like to thank all the students that were asking questions, also students that partly show that they could ask short and more precise questions than some of the more senior scientists, and that did not forget to introduce themselves. And this is what FILE is about. It's that all of us here participate. And Tim was also successful in getting the largest FILE audience we ever had so far. There were partly close to 300 people watching. And I hope that all of you, and maybe even more, come back next week when we have this fascinating talk by Susan Perry about her work on the white-faced capuchin monkeys, and you will see on the YouTube channel or the rest of our program that's coming up. With this, I'm finishing the live streaming on YouTube, but you're still welcome to stay here for 20 minutes or so for some informal chat like we already had now developing between Tim and Nancy, because FILE is about social evolution and also about the possibility to be here social, not just click away from a black screen.